Hi, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And my guest today is, again, for the second time, Professor Everett Dolman, a strategist. I used to say that Mackinder in space, and we are going to talk about space and everything that is related to space. Hello, Everett.
Hello, how are you?
Last time we discussed strategy, zones, areas in space. Of course, we will continue on that path. But I wanted to start today by asking, given the fact that very soon there will be a new president or the new old president of the United States, and people start analyzing the legacy of Donald Trump. So can we say that the lasting legacy of Donald Trump will be the establishment of the U.S. Space Force?
Well, I hope so in the sense that, as you know from our last discussion, I think the Space Force is a positive and necessary step for the United States. And so whatever happens, whoever is elected, I would hope carries on that tradition. Of course, if Trump does, he'll probably do that. And if Biden does, I think he will as well. A year and a half ago, I was somewhat concerned about that because the Space Force is still very, very small. We just swore in about 2,400 members from the Air Force and a few other services into the new U.S. Space Force. So they're wearing their name tags and their patches for that. And we've got, until then, really not located anywhere, but a small cadre of people prepping the ground. The problem they've had is funding is not reliable. There's been projections of $15 billion over 5 years, something on that order. But we've been operating on a continuing resolution this year now for a while, and it looks like that will go into the new year and will be debated again by the new Congress. So how much funding will go and how that will affect operations is hard to say. If the Democrats sweep the House, Senate, and presidency, there will probably be less available funding for Space Force than if Trump retains the presidency, and especially if he then retains the Senate. However, a year ago I was skeptical, as I said, that it might be killed by a Democratic sweep. I don't think so today. I think there's enough. Just the fact that it got stood up, just the fact that we had a situation comedy on Netflix, Space Force come out. Most people in America now know that we have a Space Force, and they think why haven't we had it sooner? So I think the Space Force will survive. What its function will be, whether it will be a war-fighting organization as its charter dictates, or if it will be more of a war-supporting organization as the Air Force Space Command has been in the past, will probably be up in the air at least for a decade.
Yeah, but actually, but what exactly happened that Trump made this decision? That there was a strong debate in Washington, D.C. I was witnessing it myself, and my opinion was that it was between the group of naysayers, that people that were saying that no, there is no technology, no transportation methods, it's so expensive, it's beyond the means, so no use doing it. And the other group that was saying that space should be a saint sanctuary like Antarctic, that no weapons, no dominance, no military assets, a completely utopian approach. And suddenly, out of the blue, in the middle, also of the crisis of the U.S. power projection across the globe, the sequester, and the reshuffling of the presence of the U.S. forces, suddenly Trump comes up with the idea of the U.S. Space Force. What happened? What happened actually? What dynamics occurred?
Well, I'm enough of a historian that of course I have to go back a ways on that a little bit. Interestingly, when Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space, the Department of Defense in the United States and others started saying, we're going to need a dedicated space force, a space service by the end of the decade in the 60s, by 1970, no question about it. The Air Force was preparing to have manned fighters and manned bombers in outer space, et cetera. That didn't come to fruition. And by 1980, again, without fruition. And it was a lot of the geopolitics of the time that we discussed on our last meeting. But in 1980, Congress was asking, why hasn't this happened yet? And dictated that the Air Force would establish a space command, the United States Space Command, after 1980. That would have a charter of coming into its own as a separate service by the end of the millennium, by 2000. Another 20 years hence. And of course, 20 years hence, we still don't have anything approaching that, any kind of space warfighting capability. And the Rumsfeld Commission was established to ask how's it going, what's going on, what do we need? And he warned the country of a space Pearl Harbor, that the Chinese were rising, the Russians were resurging, and that within 20 years we would need a space force, and that we needed it badly, and we needed to start preparing for it now. In response, after 9/11, after our focus went on to the war on terror, we actually decommissioned the U.S. Space Force. There was another commission around 2010, the Allard Commission, that said we need a Space Force and we need it within 20 years. And it's been this rolling 20-year plan, and it's really been sort of behind the scenes. And as you pointed out, the naysayers, the utopians, the folks that would sort of follow the idea that if only we can keep war from going to space, then perhaps we can, for the first time in history, open up a whole new frontier where war is thought unthinkable. And those who said, war is war, and if we have value in space, war on Earth is going to go into space whether we like it or not, and it's a realist position. But after about 1982, 1983, because of the Star Wars program under Reagan, which was very public and had very hard divided lines on technology and politics, whether or not we should have anti-missile weapons in space, all those arguments about a space force went underground. I mean, it was still talked about in the Pentagon, it was still talked about in the services, quite often as a negative, it's something we don't need. But it was there. And finally, in the 2000s, about 20 years ago, there started to be concern that the large military budgets that were being passed, the military became very popular after Desert Storm in the United States, that were being dedicated to space, and about $35 billion a year in the defense budget was being earmarked for space. And yet only a fraction of that was actually going to space. The rest of it was going to overflows in other areas, primarily airframes and Air Force sort of moving of monies around to assist in other programs, and to include war and terror programs. And those congressional districts that had earmarked that money for the development of space projects in their districts. That's how politics works in Congress. You bring the bacon home, and you have to finagle that, eat the bacon for other people, and hopefully it's a free market idea that every district working to its own benefit raises the votes of all districts. It's a good theory, and sometimes it works. But in this case, they were not seeing where the money was going. So some folks behind the scenes in some of the more powerful congressional offices around 2015 started saying, hey, we need to separate the Space Force away from the Air Force in particular, and somehow set up maybe a Space Corps like the Marine Corps, or a Space Guard like a Coast Guard for space, but a separate organization with a separate line funding. And that actually made it into the pre-budget discussions, the outline for the budget in 2017. The Senate didn't have it in time to debate it that year and pushed it to the next year. And then that got the attention of the White House. President Trump had heard about it, and in 2018, early in 2018, while he's speaking at a Marine base in California, said, hey, you know what we need is a Space Force. And it came out of the blue, just came out of the blue. He later said he thought he was just joking. He thought, he'd heard about it, thought it might be a cool thing to say. But the more he thought about it, it was a really good idea. Then it began to be fought by some of the highest levels in the military, who were worried that it would take too much money away from the other services. But President Trump pushed it, said, no, you're going to do it, fired a Secretary of Defense over it.
Over it? Yes, that was.
Well, that's the rumor anyway. The Secretary of Defense, Everett Wilson, was absolutely opposed to it on budgetary grounds, on bureaucratic grounds. And after one last sort of no, you will do this, she proposed that the budget would actually be about $15 billion a year. It was unsustainable. And then shortly thereafter, she retired to take a dream job in a university in West Texas, which she was allowed to resign. And the new Secretary of Defense was appointed quite quickly after that, Mr. Esper, and it was all systems on board for Space Force. So you can read between the lines what happened. And by September of last year, the military was on board, and in November of last year, it was inaugurated with about 2 people. It got up to about 25 people this summer, and now it is actually starting to bring on a larger group, and is charting out some pretty interesting pathways, of which war fighting and weaponry is still not a big part of it, at least not in space. It is primarily support to the warfighter, making sure that they get communications, intelligence, surveillance report, getting the like. But there is a recognition that
just like the Signal Corps in the First World War.
Oh yes, it's a very similar trajectory from the Air Force development out of the Army. Very, very similar to how the Space Force is being developed out of the Air Force. And in fact, the Air Force was using, Secretary Wilson was using precisely the same arguments against separating out a Space Force that the Army used in the 1940s about separating out an independent Air Force.
Yeah,
a little historical perspicacity could have helped out, I think, a little bit.
Of course, probably soon with the maturing of the organization, there will be a debate about the spirit and esprit de corps of the new branch, whether it's more of the Navy or more of the Air Force, in a way how they sort of operate.
Yeah. That's it's the sort of the behind the scenes, the theorists, the academics have been, there's a number of works out, books and articles, et cetera, in which folks take on either one side of or the other for theoretical perception. Should it be more like a Navy? Should it be more like an Air Force in that culture? Everyone realizes it's going to be different. There's some real good things to learn from both. But there is one of the biggest debates we've had in the country, the one that seems to really rankle a lot of folks and get people passionate, is whether they should use Navy ranks or Air Force ranks.
Yeah, I think it's critically important, given the sort of independence that later, once the really warfighting will be in space and not only between the Earth's surface and the low orbit, and it will be then more of the Navy, and sort of more autonomy and stuff. Yeah, that's the
sort of argument is the Navy approach has the Air Force. The thing about aircraft is they go up and they come down, and they need basing on the Earth and limited time. They move quickly, they move around. But the Navy, the blue water Navy of the great powers have always been global in nature, lots of autonomy, long times out to sea, long times out to space. And how you think about that in preparation for warfighting is going to be important. Also, though, you need a cultural esprit to really energize those people who will be working and who will be recruited. One of the really fascinating things about the Space Force is that the number of folks that are requesting to transfer over is very high, and recruits people coming in saying, I want to join the Space Force because that's where I want to be. I see the future there. It's highly technical. I've read a lot of
Right.
science fiction. I watch the shows and I'm excited about this. And so developing a Space Force persona and culture, the Marines is very different than the Air Force. The Army is very different than the Navy. I think is going to be critical to its success or failure. I don't think it'll fail. It's the major states, Russia and China, don't have space forces per se, but they have organizations that look precisely like Space Force.
Yeah. So maybe we'll live to see the times when the Pentagon budgets portion will be not equal as it is now, more or less, between Air Force, Army, and the Navy, but the biggest chunk will be earmarked for the Space Force as a dominant domain on the modern battlefield. And that brings me to another issue that I badly wanted to raise during conversation with you. And I need to add one more thing to the audience, to the people listening and watching. Professor Everett Dolman, my guest today, is a really esteemed, scientist is not a perfect word because strategy is more of the art than a science, which I think is even better than a science. And his treatises, his essays on strategy remind me very much of Colin Gray, another English-speaking world strategist. And I'm saying it because exactly today I finished your book titled Pure Strategy, and which I recommend to everybody, along with other books by my guest. And what struck me is that speaking of the Space Force, I think that soon will be the debate about the posture, warfighting posture that Space Force should have. Whether, of course, let's forget the utopian approach that we don't need it, like it's a sanctuary. I think that the situation where we would just want to survive in space and survive the assets, communication assets and observation assets that we have is completely out of reason, and beyond reason. So we have probably will have a debate between the deterrence by denial, so that the opponent might lose something and that's why he will not attack, or full spectrum dominance. That's what I would say. And I have started wondering today whether space, the features of outer space warfighting does not require, requires the Space Force to search for the full spectrum dominance to be really an effective military tool. What is your take on that?
Well, that's interesting. I haven't thought of it necessarily in those terms, but I think clearly space is interesting in that, at least for the foreseeable future, from a military side of it, there's going to be any warfighting platforms or capabilities will not involve human-to-human contact. It'll be robotic or long-distance standoff weaponry. But there will be a requirement for humans in space in the USSF Space Force that as human beings go commercially into space for search and rescue, for clearing blockades to space travel, hazards to space travel. But as far as deterrence goes, so there's classic levels of deterrence by denial, as you put it, and or by punishment. And the denial is if you deny the opponent the ability to strike, then they will be deterred from trying it versus, and that's a capability that you have that has an implicit threat. If you go against us, we can destroy your capability, your military capability. But the other one is the denial by punishment. We can retaliate in such a way against what you value, and that is human beings and infrastructure on the earth, to prevent you or deter you from trying to make a military strike. And I much prefer the denial one in the area of space, particularly in that a threat to say if you bother our space systems, or if you try to limit our space capabilities, or hack into our satellites, then we're willing to bomb one of your cities or or take your people hostage in some way, I think is immoral and necessary in times of war. But with the exception of nuclear deterrence, which is a whole another way of theorizing about war, I prefer the strategy by denial. And right now we don't have it. We just don't have it. The Chinese have developed a fairly robust one relative to ours, and there are people working on such things, as well as the Russians and others. And so we need the ability to not just threaten retaliation should someone interfere with what has become probably the most critical component of the United States national security, and that is space support. We need to be able to defend that. And that's where the Space Force as a military organization is starting to think in ways we haven't thought in the 60 years of human space exploration in the United States, at least not, it hasn't been the dominant way of thinking. And so only the Space Force will think of making sure that we have free access to space and can deny access to others in times of war. Only a Space Force will have that mission as primary and have the attitude that this is something we have to do. So it will be a full spectrum dominance that's required in a global war, and space is inherently global. And that means that a space capability in space and from space, as well as to space and through space, all of that will be necessary and integrated with the other capabilities. Now, you don't have to use everything when you go to war or have a conflict. Use what's most effective. But to leave something completely out that is so important. To have a capability that without it you can't even fight, much less have a war, and then choose not to defend it is a ridiculous notion that Colin Gray, who really is an influence on my thinking, would certainly agree is a bad idea.
Speaking of moving through space, recently there is a new development. So the push of the United States for signing and acceding to Artemis Accords and how to sort of deal with the moon, and one could say colonization of the moon or partition of the moon, or deciding what to do with the moon, especially this invisible side of the moon, exposed to the solar energy and probably with helium and water. And there is apparently a race between US and China who will get there first, and maybe it will be of critical importance where the base will be. Okay, so again, the real physical geography might matter, and maybe we'll all be learning the topography of the moon, as the particular base will be of much more significant importance than the other. And then the full spectrum dominance will be also need to be shown, demonstrated, just to impose, right?
And just as on the Earth, there are locations that are more suited to defense or for economic growth than other locations, and to have higher value. So it's not just topography, but resources, of course. And you mentioned water, helium-3 potential ores that might be on the moon. We just don't know for sure where they are and what will be the most valuable as far as resources go. We are starting to see incredibly important places on the moon for either a permanent human presence or for a capability to dominate areas of space, as well as to have bases that are efficient in specific locations on the moon, particularly within the shadow areas of craters and on the high mountain area of the South Pole. And those will be contested at some point, unless an international agreement that can be enforced intercedes. I proposed something as far as the moon, because we don't really know where anything is, and we do have an international treaty that says that space cannot be owned by any nation state, that it belongs to all of humanity. And yet we've had to balance that with the incentive to actually go into space. And so I proposed that we already do some sorts of global distribution in a way in space while still allowing nation states and their interests to develop space for profit, which is a terrific motivator. And that would be to use a model like the United States Homestead Act that came out after our Civil War, 1865, that we had this vast expanse of the great American West that was empty. It was not being used. It was not filled with people. And so it was simply said that anyone who goes out into the West and we had surveyed it by that time pretty effectively, can claim 160 to, in some areas, 640 acres. And if within 5 years they improve the land, as they put some sort of dwelling on it and improve the land, farmed it primarily or grazed it, that they would get full title and deed to it. And that filled the West very, very quickly, as you can imagine, as the interest of individuals to go out and start a new life for them and their families was there. I think we could do something similar with the moon, for example. The moon we could divide up into a few thousand equal parcels and then distribute them by lot to the various countries, large countries, on some formula based on population, size, economic influence, and say you would get so many parcels. But even small countries, small nations, would get some of those parcels. Now, they may never be able to go there on their own, but if resources are found there or some value is there, they could lease that land on the moon to someone who wanted it, who could use it. Now, it wouldn't be permanent ownership of those. It'd be a 99-year lease or something like that could then be sublet out. But it's a way of thinking about opening up space for commercial exploration. And I'm just finishing up a couple of books about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Rutan and many of the other space entrepreneurs in the United States, some now in China, who are putting vast effort into moving out into space commercially, mostly for transportation, but also for the value that it has out there. As that increases, we're going to have to do something to slow conflict. And so some sort of property right, temporary property right, could really galvanize that, I think. And of course, that means it's going to eventually need to be policed. And even in our own great American West, as more people moved out, so did the American Army and the cavalry to make sure there were posts available to assist settlers in trouble, to assist those who were needed rescuing hostage situations, et cetera, and to assist in the Army Corps of Engineers for building roads and other things and trading posts and all of that. A Space Force has a certain place in that, as well as an economic growth option, one that is considered fair and has international buy-in in order for it to work, at least initially by those spacefaring nations. Poland might have a great slice. And that's something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, you've thought about this for some time. And I'm always trying to see how any nation can benefit from space, or how any nation could consider a world in which there is a fairly large military understanding of space that isn't necessarily able to compete at the large level. In other words, what are some of the medium-sized and smaller powers, or even just very small states? Why would you want to develop a space capability, and what kind of space capability would that be? Would it be broad? Would it be a niche capability? How would you see Poland's role in space in the next 25 years? Either as you think it will be, or as you think it should be.
Yeah, that's of course a brilliant question, and the debate is has been stirring up in Poland, also thanks to our last conversation about proliferation and cheap things becoming less expensive, nanosatellites and so on. So let me put it into two formats. The first format that has been, I mean, to my surprise, but also to my sort of being glad, raising is that whether Poland should sign this Artemis thing, okay, and take part in it and be with NASA and others, just do something like niche thing, do this satellite, do something, this drill, whatever. Understanding that US and China are splitting it full steam, apart. And, anyway, we chose United States in this great Eurasian games. We have the US troops, we have the alliance. So at least let's benefit from that by just grabbing this boat and colonizing the moon. We will not be the first to blame anyway, if something happens there. I mean, why not if others join? So why not? And that would help our entrepreneurs, space entrepreneurs that are showing up. They are building nanosatellites, particular pieces of equipment, and they could maybe sort of harvest this, and our new space industry could maybe boom, which would be a perfect scenario for a medium-sized power or small-sized power like Poland in this new era of exploration, by using, of course, the US power transportation and this new Homestead Act, as you said, right, and in space as an umbrella protecting this new sort of move. And I'm in favor of that, and we have been pushing this agenda a little bit in Poland over the last couple of weeks. So it's a very good timing of your question. We will see what happens. As opposed to the United States, our politicians, not many of them understand that 100 kilometers above their heads there is a carbon line. Okay, I mean, it's beyond their understanding and grasping. We've never been to space. Okay, we haven't even launched a rocket into the space. The Germans did it from our territory during the Second World War, but we haven't. So, we need to remember about the difference of perspectives. Okay, we are not a spacefaring superpower, to put it mildly. So this is this, and I think this Artemis thing is a great chance. Of course, there is sort of a blockade or a stumbling problem with the European Union and ESA, European Space Agency. I mean, there is, as you know, there are always hierarchies in the world. So we sort of project our power through European institutions, so to speak, if we want to go to the global space market. And there are frictions and flows on that might be banning our involvement in Artemis program. But I think we shouldn't give too much care of that and just do it. And the second group of things is that the military application. Basically, I'm devastated that we haven't come up with our own system and our own strategy, how to approach it. I understand that given the proliferation of transportation methods and actually the emergence of the global market for transportation services to the LEO, we don't need maybe to have our own rockets, okay? That's fine, fair enough. To be debated, but okay, fair enough. But at least we should have our own satellites, a constellation of satellites, redundancy there, and downstream capabilities and some sort of a control center in Poland, okay? And some sort of indigenous autonomy of downstreaming, analyzing those data, and so that these are our data. And we don't need to buy those data on the market somewhere out of our territory. And I can say it openly, and I hope that many people in Poland will watch. I was I was doing my best to influence the decision makers in Poland about that, and I hope that also our conversation will help them today and the previous one as well, to sort of overcome the inertia that we are already late, so to speak. We need it badly. And redundancy is cheap now, achievable. I mean, young people also want to make money. I mean, they have those beautiful companies that want to take part in this race. So why not? Simply, why not? So that's my response.
That's very interesting to me because I talk a lot about national power in space, and yet in the future, I don't know how long. Of course, it has to be global power in space, and we have to work together. In the meantime, we have to survive in many ways. Poland has such a long history of scientific excellence and technical excellence, even in the those days of the German rockets, etc. And one of the things I think that is important for small countries, and by small I just mean smaller than superpower, to stay in space is for the technological opportunities it presents, and also just simply to be on top of the latest technologies. It's the technological wave, the forefront of that I call it. But your focus on independent capabilities, it's a world of fake news now, and so what would help Poland, of course, is an independent observation capability from space, certainly for intelligence, ISR we call it, but also it would help the United States too, because if we say, hey, we're seeing this happening, someone is making this kind of dangerous, provocative move somewhere, it may or may not be believed. But if Poland, France, and say Vietnam could independently verify with their own satellites, then it becomes something that the world has to take notice of and act and not allow sort of the buildups in the past that have led to great wars that have been so destructive. It's to the United States' benefit to allow this and to have this, and it's getting very easy to do. I don't know that you need the big rockets launching, but as the technology comes up for small rockets and small satellites, but even as piggyback constellations on other launches, it's a very inexpensive and doable thing in the future. For that independent capability, and it keeps you involved. It keeps the young people excited about science and technology. There's also another factor that I've been thinking about more and more of late, and that is space as sort of the repository of cultural uniqueness. If you read a lot of science fiction books, as I do, it's all of the technologies in outer space and all of the space entrepreneurs are fascinated by science fiction and love it. And one of the things that's proposed, of course, is always, as you go further out and you get these colonies, that they become havens for different points of view, different religions, different ways of thinking. But also, one of the reasons that Israel entered into space was because they are in a position where they are constantly aware that as a nation they could be obliterated. It's a place to store their culture and their history and sort of backup knowledge of who they are and who they were and their literature, not just in sort of saying in orbit or on the moon, though those are certainly just repositories of all of that. Rich history, but also the ability someday to have a homeland capability, or a in case there's an asteroid attack that wipes us all out, that there's something left of us. And it's not too expensive, but I like the idea. Have you thought about something in that?
Yeah. I can even tell you that in the morning I watched Elon Musk talking to this Martian society, and you also enumerating those reasons. Again, because he had done it before. Actually, I have read 3 books recently about space exploration. The first one might be very interesting for the American readers, so to speak, or English-speaking readers, by Konstanty Tsiolkovsky, the Russian astrophysician, astrophysic, scientist, who was writing all those things before rockets really were launched. He was of Polish origin, and he wrote a novel titled Out of Earth, where he created a plot where scientists from different countries were in the Himalayas, and they were designing the engine, the rocket, and how to get into the orbit. And he wrote it in the 20s of the 20th century. It's a fascinating, very fast read of around 100 pages. A very nice guidebook to learn mechanical, orbital mechanics and physics, written by a guy who didn't have any practice. I mean, he just understood those principles. That's fascinating. Another one, I think you mentioned today when you were calling the name of Bezos. I think he was doing. I read somewhere that he's doing his space exploration program because once upon a time, he read the book High Frontier, right? Yeah. So I read this High Frontier book as well. I always wanted to ask you whether it was really made such an impression across the United States, with this liberation points and factories there and so on, an idea of how to take all this dirty manufacturing into the space and change everything. Yeah, and the third book I read, a book published by the Martian Society about how to make a city on Mars and what rules to impose there, how society would live there. And there were like 20 ideas of different groups from across the world. And that was crazy because, I'm not sure if the watching audience could realize that, but there will be thousands of questions to be asked and answered. For example, what sort of order would be there? And if there will be private property or the money, where maybe a communist system would be better. Maybe the questions were there, or the free market economy, will that work in the situation where every error you make costs you life or in lives of other people? Yeah. So that was a fascinating read, because if we really have a settlement on the moon, even a small one, or on the Mars or on the asteroid belt, wherever out of the Earth, there will be thousands of questions regarding the philosophy and how society is set up. This new society is set up. Fascinating read. I recommend.
I'm sitting here writing all this down. I'm a big fan of Tsiolkovsky, just the father of Russian rocketry, but really, in many ways, he was read by the other pioneers, the real father of rocketry, and some of his designs are just spectacular. And I'd heard of the story that you mentioned that he wrote. Is it in English? Do you know?
I know. I have it in Polish, so
I know that's what's going to kill me. I think it might be because he is such a genius, but I'll try and find out. I did not know he was Polish. I just thought he was Russian.
His father was a Polish. It was a Russian empire, and his father was a Polish nobleman who decided to join the Tsar's. What do you say? You have clerics, across the empire. So he was one of the bureaucracy.
Apparatchik, is that the word?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah. Well, and then the High Frontier is was a bestseller in this country, though I think I don't know how much impact it had practical wise, because again, it's enough out in the future, and we were as I recall, it's 77 timeframe that was published. We had gone to the moon and were winding down, and the space shuttle would be another several years before it would even achieve fruition. But his notions, though, that space had, he wanted to create the Earth as sort of almost a park, because we could do all the dirty, manufacturing in space. And I think if we add to that, something I mentioned the last time we spoke, when we get really reliable routine access to space to start moving our most dangerous pollutants into the sun, for disposal, that's nuclear waste, radioactive, toxic waste, etc. That could be just a tremendously helpful thing to making the Earth a real paradise to live on again, clean, with wealth coming from the heavens to so we don't have to take those resources from the planet. It's a beautiful vision that, again, because it's dangerous to go into space, we've tended to use military folks, test pilots, etc. And military seems to enhance wherever we have a stable military presence in common areas, unowned areas, the oceans, the American West, etc. is stabilizing. The Mars Society one is really interesting because this is sort of like, sort of saving the culture of the future, is that, we could actually sort of do some social engineering, just see what works and try different things. If we have multiple actors feeling confident enough in going out into space that it will be safe, that it will be defended, that it will be protected. I don't know what would work best in various situations, but one of the nice things is it's not just Mars, but the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, possibly hollow asteroids. There's so many possibilities that could come up for human civilization. But one of the advantages we have, I think we could look to the conquest of Siberia and of the Americas, and even maybe parts of Africa, as having done this, but with the advantage of not having an indigenous intelligent population that has to be displaced and brutally on the way. We don't know of any intelligent life out there, so we could go ahead and really do these in a way that's more thought out and would not, doesn't have to have the legacy of such a harsh legacy against the indigenous populations where we go. It's real promise. Plus, maybe, the population of the Earth is going up and up and up, and as it goes up, we're going to have more pandemics, more problems, more unrest, more poverty, and space is an outlet for humanity. Otherwise, we're going to have to, wars are another way of depopulating, and it's not a pretty picture for the future. I worry about my grandchildren and how things might be if we just decide we're going to not go forward out into space.
Yeah, of course, it's a grim prospect. And for example, the reason why I became interested in space was actually examining the growing rivalry between the United States and China, and this has to go this way or another somehow. And as you know from our last conversation, I am being very pessimistic about how it's gonna sort of evolve. Or
if nothing changes, it doesn't look pretty. Yeah,
and it's intensifying, I guess. And the space will be also the battlefield, and that nicely brings me to the thing that I wanted to raise and ask you, for your comment and the audience to listen carefully to what I want to say about my guest today. Of course, the Space Force is thinking is far away from this utopian and idealistic thinking that space will be a nice domain where people will cooperate and so on. They are getting ready for the confrontation, the need for dominance, so that this new domain, new connectivity, new thoroughfare have a set of rules that are imposed by preferably the United States and Space Force. And that's why when I was reading the doctrine that was announced, yes, of the Space Force, I'm not sure if the word doctrine was used in this document, but actually that was it. And
yeah, the capstone document that they put out, is that what you're? Yes. Yeah, they don't use the word doctrine, but it's been widely touted as the first doctrine.
Yeah, and as far as I remember, well, your name was also mentioned there, next to Mahan and Colbert, I guess, or Mackinder, and other famous Earth-related geopoliticians and strategists that shaped the history of the world. I mean, for the audience to mark what I said and to know what I said about the influence my guess is having on the mindsets of people making decisions in the U.S. Space Force. It's understandable that the military branch has to think in terms of the zero-sum game and sort of a competitive environment. What is your take in terms? I wanted to combine those two issues. Elon Musk, rapid, innovative ways. For example, your transportation command discussed with Elon Musk the transportation by projection with his Starship. Things are happening, and how do you think this? The new space will be harnessed into the U.S. Space Force capabilities and into this growing rivalry between U.S. and China. How will that evolve?
Yeah, it's always best to make projections that will come true or not come true long after you're relevant, just to be safe. But yeah, it's always difficult. The new economy, the new space economy is very exciting. And the part that interests me the most is the public-private partnership. There's things that the space economy will do because there are people who, right now, there are these billionaires that have these visions of the future or want to leave a legacy that's positive for the world or want to be the ones to colonize Mars. I want to have that. They've just got this mass amount of excess money and want to make a better future. But it's their individual ideas, and it's who they are. But as this grows and continues to grow, the profit motive, which is what drives free market capitalism, which is something I think is a very powerful and important. It has to be regulated at the edges, but for the most part, it's a great engine of growth and wealth. And as Adam Smith said, it depends on the freedom of the individuals. Freedom and wealth freedom is the way to wealth. And I bring this up because Clay Moltz, for example, a very respected theorist who differs with me quite a bit, but is a very, very brilliant man and theorist, has argued most recently that these new economies, you see where they're coming from. They're coming from places where there is political and economic freedom relative to, say, China. China is very good at taking those innovations and maximizing the potential. It's a modified sort of communism when we look at the Marxist or the Leninist models. But in essence, the difference is between a liberal democracy that's at least trying to do better. The United States has made an awful lot of mistakes, but we do acknowledge them and try to do better, or at least until recently have done so. And versus a more dictatorial approach, a oligarchic approach of control. And he argues that the United States entrepreneurs in space and the infrastructure that the United States developed through its government spending, leasing launch facilities and allowing SpaceX and Blue Origins and Virgin Galactic and others to refurbish those facilities and use them. It's helping it's helping a lot. We're going from having to rely on Russian rocket engines to get supplies to the space station to being the best supplier of the space station through SpaceX. They're going to go ahead and provide massive constellations of microsatellites that will beam the internet to places that are underserved in Africa and in Central Asia and into China. And that's frightening to a country that's political system demands control. So this is where you get the real rub. And I've written that if nothing changes, a war between the US and China seems to be on a collision course, and that war will start over the issue of outer space. The United States, for its own national security, has to be able to see out, and it does that through space. It has to be able to see threats coming. It has to be able to monitor treaty compliance, et cetera, as do other states. China does the same, but it has no desire for us to see inside. The United States is very easy to spy on. You can just show up. Well, not now with COVID, but generally it's got an open press. And that's not the case with dictatorial states. And so it's the ability of the United States to operate freely above its landmass, even from space, is anathema to China. It has to be able to stop that. And the United States has to be able to maintain it. And that collision of ideology and space means that it's likely, if a war kicks off between the two of us, it may very well kick off in space. That may be the start of it. But if it doesn't, it will go to space immediately. A clash on the ground between proxies, perhaps, something that escalates to great power interest where forces are being directly used. I look at Syria, I see Russia and the United States not fighting each other, but coming, our forces just being in such close contact in dangerous areas, it could escalate. And when it does, it's going to go to space. It's going to go space hard. And so I prefer the American system. I'd love it to be a pan-world system of economic and political freedom. To the best that we can do that for individuals. So I hope we can prevail in that conflict in outer space. Now, that's the rub. If we think we're going to have war, or if we think we have to be so heavily prepared for war because the outcome of losing that war is so disastrous, it's very difficult to go to a globalist view where we go out as all of Earth into space united. But to do that would probably mean some sort of fairly robust global government that may or may not protect the individual cultures and desires and capabilities of individual states and peoples and locations. So to get away from war on the earth, we have to prepare for war on the earth, and it's a paradox that has plagued us since the Romans so elegantly put it, if you want peace, prepare for war.
I fully agree. Of course, it seems that the opening salvos and the phase of war that will occur in space might be very quick, like one day.
Minutes. Could be minutes.
Which will have a decisive effect on the battlefield with deep strike, long range, reconnaissance, modern scouting battle, competition over situational awareness. So it might be a decisive thing.
And the way we're planning to fight wars, all of China, 5th generation fighters with technology, with robotics and drones. One of the things that is being developed by various corporations is sort of the ability to put weapons at any place on the Earth very quickly within a half hour, 45 minutes, by launching them from space in carrier vehicles that could maybe return, maybe just launching a SEAL team through outer space to land somewhere, quickly diffuse a situation or take out a capability that's nascent. In other words, we're creating militaries that require space in order to function, much less function well. And as we do that, space becomes increasingly vital to the national security of the states. And I don't see that trend changing, going back to sort of mass human armies facing off against each other. And so it's a different set of problems. It's a different kind of deterrence. What deters? It's a different focus on stopping a larger conflagration quickly before it does build up, which has problems of its own. Of course, there's no change, no advance that doesn't have a downside. We're trying to get better at it. The more we rely on space for our military capabilities, the more we change the way we think about war. And maybe instead of saying we can't have war in space, we might start having to think, can we just keep war in space? Can we keep it off the earth? So every time we think there's the best idea, there's a plausible argument that's exactly the opposite that we need to think about. And maybe instead of thinking about preventing war in space, we should think about keeping war only in space. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be in line with what I read today in your book about strategy, which is of course the trying to attain the continuity of advantage. And if you go to war, it's with a vision of some end of it, which means that once victory is achieved and declared by both sides, especially by a loser that he has lost, then the new bargaining is beginning. So there is a chance to limit the spectrum of war once someone realizes that has lost effectively, and the longer he fights, it's completely to no avail, it's useless. So maybe in line with, completely decapitation of the capability of striking deep and seeing deep will make you surrender, for example, right? That would be the concept, yes, for example, of the space warfare.
Yeah, it's, that's when you're in a war, victory is the goal. I'm thinking wars of national survival. Of course, you have to survive, but wars end, but relations between states do not, and those relations continue. And Clausewitz made it very clear that you should never go to war unless you think, if you think you'll be worse off after the war, just don't fight it, negotiate, do something else. But sometimes you have to go to war knowing you're going to lose, because the purpose of war should always be a better state of peace. And that's not an end state. That's not, victory is supposed to solve a problem and now move on to the next one. But in relations between states at the level of strategy, those relations never end. And even now, you could say the complete annihilation of your enemy will end that problem, and then you won't have to worry about those relations. But even that doesn't end. What happens? There's still, as it was seen with the partition of Poland between the great powers before World War I, it didn't end things. It exacerbated other problems, and Poland was resurrected and had to be. And so that idea that we're searching always for a better state of peace, and that war is simply one of the ways that we have in the past used it and probably will use it in the future, then we have to separate out our theories and say, well, what if war is our tool that we will use? How will we do it? It's what we think about, and it's a dismal science. It's a grisly calculation that we have to make daily, but we do it hopefully not just to win, but to make things better.
On a positive note, at least
We
the
need one.
from the Poland's perspective, all those space assets and advancement in technology, all those sensors, the battlefield, extended battlefield, which is rich in multipliers that the technology is bringing, is changing the dynamics between great powers, great in terms of the industrial capacity and the mass mobilization that Russia was and Soviet Union was, to the favor of smaller powers, which can deliver technology and multiply if they are managed properly, administered properly. Their politicians are up to the task, and they have a agile, professional military that can, with adaptive approach, that such militaries can quite easily defeat even the great power. That was not a case since Napoleon or the French Revolution introduced the conscription and the mass armies, which was, by the way, if we analyze the history of Russia, that was exactly around that time that Russia entered the European balance of power, because the Western European powers invited Russia for their own balancing games against Britain or France or German states or Austria, and Russia was needed by them. So they were, and it was like for last 200 years always the same. And this is what is happening now as well. And the Russians are playing this card because they have nothing else. So that's why they always need to have the military, and the Russian military is the center of gravity of their edifice of state. Once it's defeated, the Russia crumbles. The edifice is crumbling. Or if the demonstration, signaling and demonstrating of capabilities of the enemy shows that Russia might lose, also it is crumbling. It's as simple as that. And if you are right that those multipliers can help the countries around the Russian peripheries, if they are modernized enough and they have access to space and they can win the isolated battles like Turkey over Idlib or in Libya, the Russia is losing the natural advantage that it used to have.
That's a very concise, sort of historical way of looking at Russia over the last 300 years, and very, very thought-provoking. It's very, I haven't heard it said that way, and I wish I had. It is important, and when, throughout history, there's sort of been this, and Colin Gray and others have talked about it, this dynamic push and pull of offense versus defense, mass versus speed. And this, in many ways, for a smaller nation, is speed and overcoming mass in many ways. What the innovations we see that space technology gives the military, as well as business and others, but for the military specifically, is an advantage in speed. And like you said, the war in space will probably be over very quickly, or at least it will be decided very quickly. How long it lingers is when one side decides to surrender and negotiate, or quit and negotiate at any rate. But it's going to be quicker and quicker and quicker, and that does give great advantage to smaller nations, even nations that are less technologically advanced on the ground. And we see this in wars all around the world, where the great nations using sort of mass capabilities are not having their way with small nations. And we even have now the super empowered individuals, the ones with the social media and mass and certain types of poisons and other things can have huge effects that they did not have in the past. And if the world is changing, it's changing faster. And not only militaries, but politicians and business has to be agile. It's agility, the ability to adapt to the situation as it's changing so quickly, that will determine victory in the future, and not necessarily mass. In fact, probably less and less mass, because mass is slow.
Mass is slow, and the perception, as Sun Tzu was trying to persuade all the readers, is becoming more important and acute in the sense that it quickly translates into political gains and this Bismarckian way of fight and negotiate at the same time.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that in the old times of mass armies, or at least it was not that obvious. And today is the perception who's winning, who's losing, tactical engagements that may really translate into great strategic gains politically in the Clausewitz and loop between the military engagement, if it's properly managed by one of the parties and enlarged and propagated or this way or another. This created a leverage. That creates a currency in international affairs, leverages, yeah. And that, by the way, it's a fascinating thing, and space is a critical and increasingly important factor. We'll be slowly coming to an end, so pardon me, but I'll ask the last, maybe very obvious question, but the answer might not be obvious, and the consequences of maybe not the answer, but what will be within the answer might be seminal for the future of the world. So we are right before, we are recording this conversation right before the elections in the United States. Who is going to win?
It's the U.S. and it's fickle and never say something is ironclad. But I think the pollsters are giving it 3-to-1 to 6-to-1 odds that the Democrats under Joe Biden will win the presidency, and almost that close. But there's a good chance they'll also win the Senate, which would give them the ability to legislate and administer pretty much as they wish. They will be constrained somewhat by a newly conservative leaning Supreme Court, which is the highest arbiter in the land of constitutionality. But Donald Trump has shown throughout his whole life that he defeats the odds. So I don't know. So let me just sort of say what the future of space looks like under both. If Trump wins and retains control of the Senate, we will see the Space Force go on fairly strongly with good support. As you and your viewers may know, the United States budget is in many ways a surrogate for our strategy. And we are right now without a budget. We are on a continuing resolution, which gives us, we sort of just go along until the budget will be passed. If Biden wins and the Democrats control Congress, then that budget should be passed fairly quickly. It will probably cut into U.S. Space Force. It will take away more from the Space Force military side and move more towards a private-public partnership in space development, as happened under the Obama-Biden administration prior to the Trump administration. There's going to be a lot of pressure to undo everything that the Trump administration has done, because from day one, the Trump administration has tried to undo everything the Obama administration did previous to it. I think the Space Force will survive, though how it survives will be deeply influenced by this election. A year ago, I wasn't sure that would happen, but it will. It's become ingrained now in much of the population of the United States as a necessity in a way it wasn't even as little as a year ago. So I'm preparing for all of those, as one should, but I think that what we're going to see is a continuation of Space Force with a slightly adjusted mission, less public announcements. We have a national space policy that comes out every few years with each administration, and frankly, they've been essentially congruent over the last 5 administrations. We're going to reserve the right to defend ourselves in space with the military. We're going to reserve the right to use the military to guarantee our access to space. But it's how much focus is put on that versus partnerships with other nations and partnerships with the economy. So I'll expect in the likelihood of a Biden presidency, we'll probably not think too much about space and Space Force for 6 months, and then it'll move much more towards conciliatory language while still preparing to defend assets from space. This is something that we've always reserved the right, but we've never actually practiced it. We're on the way to doing that now, to actually defend those vital assets for us, and by the way, everyone else. And I think we'll continue to move for that. The trade-off will be, it'll be less belligerent, perhaps, than a Trump win and a Trump Senate coming back, but the effect will be similar, the same. And in both cases, through deregulation or through advanced support through the public-privates or public monies to private entrepreneurs, I think the move out into space in the future, at least I'm very optimistic that we'll get that to happen within my lifetime. That will be better, and we will have permanent populations on the moon, for example. I know that doesn't answer your question directly.
No, it answers even better than I expected. So it's perfect. So you believe in Elon Musk and other barons of that space?
Well, I know it was the last question, but I'm always, I come somewhat from a union background in my family, and as I get older, I get a little bit more worried about who's going to take care of me when I get older. But I've always also worried very much about how much should a nation rely on private enterprise for its national security. Reading Machiavelli and his abhorrence of mercenaries, and I feel the same. I worry that there are some things that the government can do in large project spending. I've talked about as well, not only could we talk about manufacturing green from outer space and getting rid of pollutants, but also we could generate energy, solar energy in outer space and provide it to the world. And since my preference would be to provide it without charging for it, only government is likely to do that. The profit motive for private enterprise, which gives it its dynamic growth, which we all like and need, also tends to get me a little bit worried about wars. If wars are profitable, when do they end? And we've been fighting a war in the United States for far too long. We've changed the way we fight commitments for longer, but profit always worries me a little bit. So that balance has to be maintained between the public and the private. The case of our current, sort of egoistic, dynamic corporation builders, you look at Musk and Bezos in particular, and they really start from almost nothing, and they build these massive wealth that generates income, generates jobs, generates ideas, etc. But that distribution of wealth also generates class conflict and other such things. So it has to be put in partnership. I like Elon Musk putting his automobile, his convertible, in outer space. I just love that. I just thought it was a cool move. But it's an ego. They're in it for the ego. Others are in it for profit, and those taken to the extreme have to be reined in by government action. So I just worry that we'll get to the point where we say, those guys have been doing it so well, let's just let them handle national security. And I'm really leery of that. I think we should capitalize on the innovation, on the agility they have. but be careful that we don't, that the people don't lose control of the national security apparatus.
Yeah, but apparently we're really having a hard time to finish our conversation, which is a good sign and a promise for another one. But, I think that at the end of the day, it's always the government that has a decisive vote. There was such a debate about globalization, that the big corporations rule the planet Earth, that decoupling from China is impossible, and so on. And the managers, CEOs of corporations are much more powerful than the presidents. And now what? You see what
Well, and then you get the corporate president that we have now, and now that he's a corporation, the head of a corporation, but the others are all backed by corporations, and it's the world we live in.
Yeah, but still, if Trump decides to go to trade war with China, then he has such leverages against the business.
Oh yeah.
And he has executive orders and all other things, and the U.S. market is the weapon.
It is.
And regulation.
Access to it, yeah.
And the streets. I mean, if people want change, the corporations must follow. So I think it was a very sobering observation about like the last couple of years. It's not the big corporations that rule the world. It's good that these are the politicians. This is the politicians still. Of course, we can debate about the quality, how they are, voted in or whatever. But still, it's the sort of a.
Well, the nation state as it's constituted today and has been since arguably the Peace of Westphalia, it's the state that has the police and the military power, and that will trump. Not to pun, but that will trump any abuses by private industry. The point for America that Clay Maltz makes, that others have made, that one of our great strengths is our innovation economy and our free market economy, and it absolutely is. And I'm a big believer in the free market, also in global free trade. But there are those. But every capitalist wants to be a monopolist because that's where the real money is, and only the government can not only provide the infrastructure for the free market to thrive, but also has to be able to rein in the potential monopolists and oligarchs. Otherwise, you can get some very, otherwise there's corruption that happens. But we've struck a pretty good balance generally in the United States between commercial and government. And so when I say I worry about it, I'm always going to worry about it. I'm always going to worry about when we get rid of both ways that this could swing. But I like asking that question. As the last time we talked, the great question I think on War and Space was can the United States afford to be the second to weaponize space? Is it so quick that we will be behind? I think the great question here is how much of our national security do we outsource to private enterprise? It's just a very good question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope that we will see each other again very soon.
I do too.
To continue. For the time being, thank you very much. Our guest was Professor Everett Dolman. We discussed space. Stay with us.